Hello everyone, this is Neha Pellegrino, Senior MSP Compliance Counsel, and I wanted to take a moment to welcome you to the ECS on MSP podcast. As you all know, ECS is dedicated to assisting you navigate all the complexities of MSP compliance, but we believe that compliance shouldn't be static. The rules evolve, technology evolves, and the way people consume information evolves, which is what led us here. While we've been continuing to connect with you through our monthly webinars, which we love providing, we recognize that this industry moves really fast, and so do the professionals working in it. So the idea behind the podcast is about meeting you where you are by delivering content in a way that fits your schedule. And we're really excited to have this be a part of our ongoing commitment to share knowledge and support you. Each episode will bring you practical insights and real-world discussions, all in a format that's easy to listen to and easy to learn from, almost like you're sitting on the couch in our office. So whether you're here to stay compliant, deepen your understanding, or just hear from the voices that live and breathe this work every day, you're in the right place. That being said, let's get started.
So we have some great presenters today, including Marty Casavoy, Senior Vice President of Compliance and Business Development, Neha Pellegrino, Senior MSP Compliance Counsel, and Lou Perazzo, Vice President of our National Accounts. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Neha to go through today's rundown.
Thanks, Adriana. So today's rundown, we're actually going to start by talking about the CMS webinar that occurred last week. That is regarding the civil money penalties, or CMPs. And so there's a update that we have here that we're going to talk about first. The second part is we're going to dive right into the 2025 benchmarks. So this are the statistics that were released in November, talk about the data there, and then we'll dive into kind of what that all means and get into some of the trends that we're seeing. And then we'll close out with questions from you guys. All right, so I'm going to hand this over to Marty. I think he's going to start by giving us some updates regarding the webinar that was held a week ago today on civil money penalties.
Thanks, Neha, and thanks everybody for joining us today. We have a lot of information to pass along in sort of a short amount of time, and we wanted to start here, which is a little bit out of context for the topic, but the webinar that CMS held a week ago today, almost at this exact same time, is really important. The civil money penalties webinar was held on January 15th. It was long delayed, I would say, due to the government shutdown, and there were some important key takeaways for you all. Really, regardless of whether you do work comp Medicare set-asides or workers' comp cases, liability cases, no-fault cases, doesn't matter. If you're involved at all in handling an injury claim, this is some information that you should use, and it's important news for y'all. So the first piece and the most important overarching theme here is that CMS's real emphasis is just trying to get the data correct, right? So they want you to report the data correctly in a timely manner, but they want the data to be reported timely, right? They're going to figure some of the details out on the back end. And so there is a significant emphasis in this webinar on the enforcement timeline, as well as on the procedural appeals process. And I think it's also really critical to understand from CMS's perspective that they're still going to be work in progress on some of these things. They haven't even begun to do the first auditing. Now, the first piece of this is the first key takeaway for us, and you'll see we put a blog out about a week ago. There was also 5 key takeaways that we published on our LinkedIn page, and you may have seen this circulated from your local ECS rep, but the first one is definitely that CMS's first audits begin in February 2026. So basically what CMS is looking at is they're looking, on a go-forward basis, they're going to be looking at the prior quarter, and in the following quarter, they're going to do an audit, and they do that audit usually in about the middle of the quarter. They'll start that audit in the middle of a quarter. So basically what they're doing is in February, so next month, really in about probably 10 days, 2 weeks, they're going to look at all of the claim data that was reported, in this case, from October 11th, which is the first day that penalties could have existed. So October 11th, 2025, first day that claims could have been late, all the way through December 31st. They're going to pull up all of the claim data that was reported across NGHP, so work comp liability no fault, as well as GHP, group health plans. And they're going to try to figure out how many of those claims are eligible for, or how many of those claims existed, and then they're going to look at a percentage basis and try to figure out which of those claims are in fact potentially late. So they're going to look at if it's 50% of all the claims were in fact liability claims, no fault claims, and work comp claims. So no fault NGHP claims. They're going to be looking at 125 out of 250 claims, right? That's it. That's all they're going to be able to look at in a single quarter, right? It's 250 claims. So you have a low likelihood that you're going to get hit, but there are going to be claims that are going to be reviewed, and that review will start next month. When they do send out initial CMP notices, they would be expected to be received in March of 2026. So we're about 6 to 8 weeks away from the first piece of these penalties being issued. Now, it could be that there's none that are issued, right? One of the things that CMS did say was that if your claim is clean or not reviewed, you will get no notice. The only time that you'll receive a notice is if you in fact have potentially created a late reporting situation, right? So no news is good news, right? If you haven't seen anything, heard anything, April, May rolls around, you haven't really heard anything yet in your claim, guess what? No news is good news. That's good. Workers' comp CMP enforcement, and this is really important for everybody on the line who's handling work comp claims. Workers' comp CMP enforcement is delayed until July 2026. So we'll talk a little bit today about mandatory MSA reporting, right, and the impact that we may be starting to see with mandatory MSA reporting. But remember, mandatory MSA reporting started April of last year, right? So CMS is giving people until July of 2026 for claims that were reported on and after July of 2025 for CMP. So basically, they're delaying CMP enforcement by 6 to 9 months, depending upon how you look at it, for those cases. This is important. So if you have a work comp claim today that could have been reported in 2025 but wasn't, you're okay right now based upon CMS's commitment to deny or to delay. Next up, profile reports, recertification is critical. So this was a huge takeaway for us. The person who is going to receive the written communication for CMPs, for civil money penalties, is the account representative. So make sure that your address on file, make sure the representative on file is accurate. If it's sent to the wrong address because you haven't updated your profile recertification, that's not good. So make sure that you have everything accurate. These are going to be mailed out. They're not going to be emailed out. We've heard some rumors that they're going to be emailed out. They're not going to be mailed out, in fact. So make sure you get the address on file correct. Also, make sure that if you have an account manager, that account manager knows and is aware of the fact that they are going to be also receiving a copy of those CMPs. In some cases, ECS will be your account manager. In other cases, ECS won't be. We certainly would recommend that we are your account manager for sure. So just be mindful of all of these things. And in fact, I think that the most important piece of this whole entire thing for everybody when you're looking at this is that the data that you report needs to be as accurate as possible, absolutely as accurate as possible. And you want to make sure that you're doing everything right. One thing that we did not hear too much from CMS, and this is also important, is we did not hear from CMS about the change to the that we talked about in the last webinar around WCMSA reporting and the fact that CMS is changing around the TPOC reporting windows. So that's really something to think about here. We're connecting those two dots here. So we didn't hear anything there, and we also didn't hear anything from CMS about what they're actually doing with the back end data. So we didn't hear anything from CMS about all of the stuff that they're doing on the back end, which was delaying the review of MSAs, which we'll get into in today's webinar. Now, the last thing that I want to cover here, just the last key takeaway, is this piece around good faith beneficiary identification. This really only applies in liability cases, but CMS clarified and I think hopefully made it a little bit easier for good faith beneficiary identification, because they said basically if you just send 3 written communications, that's good enough. The regulations say it should be 2 written, 1 electronic. CMS clarified 3 written communications is good enough, and also CMS clarified that in that very first communication that you send to the beneficiary or their attorney, and the beneficiary or their attorney says, we're never going to provide you with this information, you can rest on that. You don't have to keep going back and forth to that beneficiary. So not hearing everything that we wanted to hear. Certainly we wait for CMS to have another webinar. We anticipate that other webinar will focus only on WCMSA, mandatory WCMSA reporting, but we're still waiting on that. So with that, that's sort of the background on the civil money penalties update, but we want to get to the next key piece here, and we go into the next slide. Why are we all here? We're here to talk about CMS data, and here to talk about that are Lou and Neha. They're going to cover the 2025 benchmark report and really what it means to your MSAs.
Yeah, and Marty, I thought one of the most valuable things that we learned from the webinar last week was just helping RREs and insurers and TPAs and everyone that is handling Section 111 reporting to really plan out when they should expect things. So if we take this, that this is going to be the schedule you look at, it's about 6 weeks after the last reporting window that they will begin the audit review, and then about a month later is when they'll send any potential CMP letters. So I think going forward, if you think about it in those terms, after about 6 weeks after your 12th week, that's when you'll do those audits. But yeah, we're here to talk about the benchmark data. And Neha, I know that you've been involved in this over the years. I've been involved with this part over the years, and I would say that it's been interesting to see the total number of submissions decrease. And as you can see on the top left there, that 13,884 number, that marks a 3-year trend of reduction of submissions, or I should say approved MSAs. And what are you seeing as some of the reasons why that is?
Yeah, sure. So we're definitely going to dive into a lot of what we're seeing here. I just wanted to give some background to the image that we have here. This is an actual stat sheet of the benchmark data that was released in November. For those of you that are not viewing slides but are listening, this is a very simple 1-page, 2-table report. And you know how much this industry loves their data. So, we're able to decipher a lot by analyzing what's going on with these statistics. But, as Lou just mentioned, something that we found quite striking was the, decrease in total submissions that we see through submitting your MSA to CMS. And so there's a lot of factors here. One of them being the recent halt in reviewing zeros, which we all know came about in July of 2025. We've also seen, an increase in non-submit MSAs, right? So we can dive into that a little bit. There's also an increase in a lot of developed files that we've seen. So when it says, total recommendations completed, that means that an actual decision was, was determined. And so in order to do that, you need to kind of get through the whole review process. So that was,
Neha,
yeah.
Sorry, that was one of the things that I saw as well. We have seen our determinations department, the folks that handle our CMS submissions and working with CMS on their development letters, saw an increase in development letters, even though the same information was submitted. And I think one of the interesting things about looking at the tables here and trying to summarize what we're looking at, the total approved MSA number over the last 5 years has increased every year. We're at 86,000 and change for what Medicare has approved in MSA number, but the industry really has been recommending almost the same amount for the last couple of years as it is. So if we look at the total MSA submitted, there's about a $17,000 difference on average with what is being submitted as the industry compared to what Medicare is approving. And I think that goes a long way to tell that Medicare is, even though the treatment standards haven't changed and people are treating the same way and being prescribed the same way, what we're seeing from Medicare is that they are trying to put more money in the treatment portion of the allocations. And I know that prescription drugs, Neha, are a big part of this. And I don't know if let's move on to that next slide and talk about just what we're seeing from recommendations, and then we can get into the nitty gritty on that. But you mentioned, Neha, there's been a decrease or a downward trend over the last 3 years about what Medicare is approving. And it really, the first thing that I want to talk about with you is that increase in what we call that evidence-based or clinical-based or non-submit Medicare set-aside, where the industry is taking a real-world look at what someone needs rather than some of the arbitrary things that Medicare might put in there.
Yeah, that's a huge one, Lou, for sure. I think we've seen a real swing in the overall industry acceptance of non-submit allocations, particularly after CMS expressly clarified language within the reference guide 4 years ago, back in 2022. And they sort of came down to say that really the standard is to demonstrate that sufficient future medical funding was provided and that the use was appropriate, right? So the standard is don't inappropriately shift the burden of medical care onto the Medicare program, and the ways in which you show that is by providing reasonable allocating funds and misappropriating those funds. So really the decision to then opt out of the submission process shouldn't have like an overarching improper result in rejecting medical care for the beneficiary. And I think that as an industry as a whole, we've seen that through, again, upswing in non-submits, the fact that submission is a voluntary process. I know that there's a lot of clients that have their own internal protocols, but we've seen a lot of shifts in that department as well, as far as how they want them handled, just on a sort of internal claim basis, as well as the now mandatory work comp MSA reporting aspect. So you have that where even if you're not submitting an MSA, if you have a work comp Benny or a Medicare Benny, that work comp MSA is going to be reported, right? That number is going to be reported. And so Medicare can then check on that. So these are all aspects which I think are kind of driving forces to, I think, see a trend in sort of the downward trend of CMS submissions overall.
Yeah, and I want to hit that what you just said was great. That confidence in the WCMSA reporting. This has to do. I receive a lot of questions around specifically this part. When you're talking about what happens when professional administration is submitted versus isn't submitted, but it contradicts what is being submitted as part of the CMS review process, the MSA review process, and the confidence in that aspect of it. What are you seeing from an operational standpoint in the overall confidence in the WCMSA reporting? This could be for you, Neha, or Marty. What are you guys seeing with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just real quick just chime in here to say that, when we think about confidence in the MSA reporting, I think the understanding that some people have is, hey, well, at least I'm getting the information to Medicare, even if I'm not submitting the case. So CMS has the opportunity to do something with the data. I think the challenge that we see, sort of the double edge of that sword, and it's something that we've been monitoring quite a bit, is in those rare circumstances where something happens with the data that is reported that doesn't necessarily line up with a submitted MSA, right? So that actually kind of cuts against the confidence in the submission process, because of the fact that CMS seems to have put all of the sort of weight on the side of, well, the MSA data that was submitted via Section 111 or transmitted via Section 111 is more reliable than the data that we see in a proposal that we receive from a submitter or from the lawyer or from the carrier or TPA itself. So I think that when CMS sort of elects to go with one side, which is the transmitted MSA data or transmitted Section 111 data as sort of like the winner in between the two amounts, then that undermines overall confidence in the submission process itself, because people say, well, there's maybe a downside to it. That being said, Neha, it is a small number of cases, relatively speaking, that we've seen this come in, and we have seen a little bit of movement in this over the course of the last, I'd say, few weeks, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. You know, like you said, I think that this is just another aspect which I think is going to just continue to sort of increase the sort of the trend that we've seen as far as you know, submission being a voluntary process, recommended but voluntary process, and I think that's really kind of hitting home with a lot of carriers now.
Two
Right,
aspects that I've seen on this side. I think the first one, and I'm curious as an industry, I know what we do here at ExamWorks, but the total number of submissions that were for $0 prior to July of 2025, I gotta believe was in the 10 to 20% of a total claim submission aspect of it. So when you think about the fewer the reduced number of $0 MSAs that they now review, that Medicare now reviews, that could lead to that number, and maybe that's why we saw that. Maybe that will be a bigger trend when we get the 2025 data and 2026 data at the end of this year and at the end of next year. So when you look at that aspect of it, combined with the that we're seeing a lot more Medicare set-asides, or here at ExamWorks, we do future medical allocations for cases and with client approval for cases settling under $25,000 with a Medicare beneficiary. So many of the cases that are requiring that WCMSA data don't actually qualify for CMS submission. So we've seen sort of an increase in that over the last few years, especially over the last year since WCMSA data was mandatory for all of these types of settlements.
Yeah, and I know we're going to be diving into this a little bit more too, but again, when they talk about total submissions, we're talking about completed submissions. So another aspect is all of the developed files that we've seen, which we've seen an increase in, and so we're going to kind of get into some of the hurdles there as we continue on through today's session. I think we can probably jump on to the next point here. Yeah, so another huge data point that we saw in there is a consistent uptick over the last 5 years in the percentage change between the CMS approved value versus the proposed work comp MSA value. Specifically, I mean, I think it's almost 25% at this point, and this continues to increase. So this increasing gap really sort of highlights Medicare's conservative approach to future care projections. So we know that Medicare kind of follows a worst case scenario approach. That's what we call it. You know, it's sort of a snapshot of what's being recommended at that time, and then that's allocated over the course of lifetime, right? So it could be, you know, very vague recommendations. Sometimes it could be, oh, could need a spinal cord stim, could need lumbar surgery, and could need a lifetime of opiates. And then guess what? All of those are going to be in the MSA, whether or not it's reasonable or not. So I think that's sort of one factor that's sort of continued to increase this widening gap. Not to mention pricing updates. We know, you know, with inflation, prices only go up, and so kind of staying current on, you know, what is the current cost for, you know, cervical fusion right now, and those sort of trends. But
one of the
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to piggyback on that, one of the trends that I've seen from a few of our clients is they want to that aggressive allocation, that real world look at what someone wants to see. Insurers are less hesitant to submit those aggressive MSAs because that's really what someone needs. They want to push the envelope with what the treatment the person actually is getting versus what the doctors are recommended versus some of the arbitrary things that Medicare might put on there. So we've seen an increase in submission of what some other people might call a non-submit, but people are so confident in what someone needs, they are submitting that. So while there is this there is this pushback, or there is this counter hire world that those types of entities are going into, what they're finding is they're going to save more money in the long term by being aggressive. Being aggressive at the outset with your claims handling, but also being aggressive with what is submitted and what is being recommended. They're seeing a lower approved amount compared to what might have happened if you just did a traditional MSA on that case. And Marty, I know you've been involved in setting up a lot of those protocols with our clients. What are you seeing from that side when you have that aggressive, let's submit a clinical MSA to Medicare and push the envelope?
Yeah, so I mean, it is certainly something that we see certainly more as a trend compared to, say, 4 or 5 years ago. And you can see it bear out in the numbers. I don't think it's just ECS that's having an impact in this, but there is slightly, because it's not all cases by any stretch for ECS. There's still a minority of the organizations that we work with, but those organizations that do, let's say, push the envelope on data or on their submissions themselves and make an aggressive approach, that's probably reducing somewhat the average MSA that's proposed to CMS. And yet in some of those cases, we do see CMS come back and say that the case is approved, right? And so it's not really so much individually a case. You could have a case that's an evidence-based or non-submit MSA, and that might not be that much different from an MSA that would be intended for submission, because the person's treatment is really plateaued and is really low, and it doesn't cost that much money to have the types of treatment that the person has. Where you see the larger delta, certainly on average, is in those cases where there is a more costly surgery or more costly treatment that maybe has a very small chance of happening, but it's enough of a chance that CMS says, hey, if we're going to sign off on this case, we want this case to be inclusive of that costly surgery or that costly treatment. So when those things happen, that's really where the big delta comes in, as opposed to, I'd say it's not the majority of cases, but a high percentage of the cases where there's not that much difference between what you would submit to CMS and what maybe a non-submit MSA would look like. So, but overall, we are seeing, obviously, if you just look at the numbers, you can see it. The average proposed amount that goes to CMS has dropped a little bit. And of course, what that's resulted in is the increase in CMS's recommendation and the big delta of 24%
And I think when you're talking about treatment and you're talking about working with what someone needs for treatment, it comes down to communication. If we can move on to that next slide, this leads right into some of the common hurdles we've seen with CMS development. Neha, you are intimately involved with our CMS submissions team. What are you seeing in terms of what records are needed and then where some of the gaps might be?
Yeah, sure. So there's definitely, an overarching theme that we see with a lot of the developed files that we have. So medical records is a big one. We always hear, okay, they need 2 years of medicals, 2 years of medicals. That seems to be like burned into our brains at this point. But, really what they're talking about is the most recent 2 years of treatment. And this applies for all conditions. I think that's where sometimes there can be a lot of confusion, because you may have a claim that has multiple body parts. And so you'll say, well, we've sent all the records that we've sent records through current. So why do they keep asking us for 2 years of medicals? And it's, because maybe there's a left shoulder, left hip, left knee. And then at some point in those records, the left shoulder treatment has fallen off, but they're still treating for the other two conditions. The language that they put within those development letters is boilerplate language that they're popping in there. They're not going to tell you specifically, sometimes we're looking for treatment for what happened to the left shoulder, right? So it's really up to, your claims adjusters, and it comes down to us really kind of working the file a lot and kind of really digging into those medicals to say, okay, what is it that they're pulling out of here? They're pulling something out of here. And so then you can say, okay, you know what it is? It's the left shoulder. So now we need to address that. What happened to it? Are they still treating for it? Has treatment stopped, and why did treatment stop? And then you need to address that specifically. Medicare always wants you to sort of prove the negative, right? So show us that you're not treating, which seems counterintuitive, but they ask for it all the time. So another area where this happens is where there's a decline in treatment, right? So maybe they've just stopped treating last year, right? And so you say, well, this is all we have. These are all the medicals that we have. What else can we show you? What you can show is you can prove the negative by getting, we have a sort of screenshot here of a template that we utilize in our office a lot, a last day of treatment letter. So this is a letter that goes straight to the physician's office where they can sign off on, the last date that I saw John Smith was on such and such date. I treated him for this injury. And have a current date on there. So you want to say, okay, this is the last date that he actually treated. And, those are sort of the workarounds for some of the, I guess, common hurdles that we see. It's really just about kind of proving to Medicare that, if there isn't a stop in treatment, that's when it stopped. And it can be kind of cumbersome. And we do actually have services that we can help in order to, assist your adjusters. We have a really great resolution team that will actually reach out to physicians if needed. Anything else that I was missing there, Lou?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say in addition to that, just to reiterate the communication, working with the attorneys involved. The claimant attorneys do a great job of making sure that their people are getting the treatment that they need up until it's time to settle and they need the MSA, and then all of a sudden, all right, how do we not undo everything we've done during litigation, but what does this person really need in treatment? Let's go to that doctor and get clarification, the treating physician or whatever the controlling medical might be in your state. So in California, it might be different than what it is here in Massachusetts. So just making sure that whatever is controlling is accurate when we're talking about that.
Yeah, so we did just get a quick question. I'm just going to address it while we're still on here, and that was in regards to prescription records. So yes, they will want prescription records as well, and for over the course of the last 2 years. And so the hang up with that, which we don't see as much, but we do see sometimes, is, if they're not actually actively getting prescriptions, through their, I guess, work comp treater, they're going to want personal prescription records. And so again, that's another area that can get a little sticky, because then you're kind of going through the personal, that person's personal, like Walgreens prescription or what have you. But those are kind of things that CMS wants to see, whether it's related or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. And I'm glad that they raised, the person raised the RX piece too. It's very frustrating. And I think that there's nothing more frustrating as an adjuster. There's nothing more frustrating as an attorney than you're trying to settle a case, or a judge. You're trying to settle a case, help get a case settled. You need to get CMS's approval. And yet they continuously ask for additional information that you don't feel like is appropriate. You don't feel like you can grab, right? And so, one question at some point that you do sometimes have to ask yourself, and it'll depend upon your organization's program. It'll depend upon the parties involved, but is it at what point is it become impossible to gather the information that is necessary? So I will say that, that is something that, Lou, Neha, myself, and others in our organization have certainly had conversations with folks where, hey, we need to gather the following, but the only way that we're going to gather this is, maybe it's impossible to grab that information for whatever reason. Maybe it's a challenge with a claimant, maybe it's a challenge with claimant's attorney, maybe it's a challenge with just having access to the information because that doctor's office is now out of business, right? So when those types of challenges do arise, we do, in fact, work together to try to figure out, what are the balance of equities, or what's the risk when we look at withdrawing our submission or just abandoning the submission versus, continuing to plow ahead. One thing to point out, and this does not happen very often at all, but in those circumstances, the rare circumstances where the development lasts for more than 1 year, and that that should be only a handful of cases, at all ever for any one organization, then you do have to resubmit the entire thing. So the key theme in all of this is that CMS, the key thing in all of this is that CMS is asking for you, as Neha said, to prove that negative. So huge issue in some circumstances. The majority of cases, this is not a problem. it still is, 75 to 80% of the time when we submit a case to CMS, it sails right through with no development. It's those cases that do have development where, it can take 3, 4, 5 times as long because you're having to go back, get the information, subpoena the records, etc., things like that. Now, we do have one comment in the chat box. It says, we are told the last date of treatment letter is not sufficient. If they have not treated for the last 2 years, then we need to obtain their medical records on a private basis on non-work comp related issues. So I'm going to touch on this briefly, and then Neha, I know that you've dealt with this quite a bit yourself, so I'm going to ask you to chime in as well. But that's also a concern. So sometimes you'll have medical conditions that may materialize in the course of the treatment that we've submitted or that somebody else has submitted, where it appears to be a non-industrial condition that has sort of matriculated as part of as materialized, I should say, as part of the work comp condition. Sometimes in those circumstances, Medicare is going to ask for information from people's personal treating physicians, and they really, really struggle to be able to provide that information. In many cases, it's not appropriate. We've made the argument many times that it's not appropriate. So with that being said, Neha, I'm going to turn that over to you as well. Just comment real quick there on those circumstances where it is a challenge to nail down medical records where people's, their personal medical conditions, that no one wants to say, hey, this is my family doctor that I've been going to for the last 30 years. Sure, you can have all their records. That's just a big non-starter for a lot of people, and it can be a real challenge.
Yeah, that's definitely an area where we can have a hang up. I mean, to say that a last date of treatment letter isn't sufficient, I don't know if that's always the case. I do think that CMS has gotten kind of a little hip to kind of what a lot of us are doing as far as, the boilerplate templates that we're sending, and they don't really care to see all of that. So sometimes it needs to be a little bit more, I guess, tailored for that specific claim in order to kind of really get them to kind of move the needle on those. But yes, you do have instances where, like Marty said, maybe there's something that came up that's not related. Maybe there's denied conditions that they want addressed, right? Because before we were kind of submitting all of those as maybe separately as a 0 or what have you. They're not accepting those anymore. So maybe you have some conditions that are accepted, some conditions that are denied. Well, they're going to want they're going to want those records for the denied treatment because they want to see who's treating for those. So that's where, you can kind of have those hangups. And then, like Marty said, it's kind of a cost benefit. I know we've talked before about every claim being like a fingerprint, right? So where are you with this claim? Is it important for you to move forward with settlement? Have you taken sufficient effort to, take Medicare's interest into account? If you've done all of that, maybe it's time to abandon the submission and move forward with settlement. Utilize your MSA as, your means of sort of showing evidence that you've taken Medicare's interest into account and put aside an appropriate amount for future medicals. And then again, if you have a Medicare Benny, go ahead and report that amount as well.
And I guess this is a good time to put that disclaimer in there that this is not legal advice. We were just discussing CMS's actions and policies and what our experience has been, because every client has their own protocol and what their appetite is for non-submit products and withdrawals and moving forward with submission. But that being said, we just got an interesting question in this world. And that has to do with what will Medicare do if they receive a pharmacy record and part of it has been redacted. And Neha, I know that you've reviewed a bunch of those. I've reviewed a bunch of those. I believe that Medicare would not accept a redacted one, and that is a good opportunity for a non-submit if protocols will allow that.
Correct. Yeah, that'd be a non-starter for sure. And I mean, we've even seen ones where maybe the printout isn't very legible or it's kind of blurry, and they'll send that back as well. So having something that's been specifically redacted would definitely kind of be grounds for development on a file like that.
Yeah, so we can move on now to the last sort of core section here, which is let's call it the top 5 allocation issues that we see. And these are issues that result in some of the challenges that we've been talking about all along. They result in development issues. They result in situations where your CMS issues a counter hire. They result in situations where you might decide, you know what, we think that all of the accumulation of all of these things makes it so that we don't want to submit the case at all. We want to sort of opt out of submission. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't, as Neha pointed out earlier on, be doing something that's the right thing. You need to be doing the right thing in all these cases, but that right thing might not be submitting the case to CMS for review and approval. So first one, this is one that we see constantly. I'd say that, most of the folks in the line, you probably have had a case just like this in your inbox at some point or another, but the claimant won't pursue the treatment that is recommended by the treating physician. And this is, Lou and Neha, this is certainly probably the number one issue that we continue to see and have seen really now for like the last 15 or 20 years, which is that the person's received a recommendation from their doctor, or has, better yet, the doctor has identified that they may be a candidate in the future for a particular surgery or implantation or something like that. And then they're just like, we're not going to pursue it. I don't want to do that. I'm afraid of needles. I'm afraid of going under the knife. I'm afraid of being, sedated, whatever the case may be. It might be against their religion. Who knows what the answer is, but they just are not going to pursue it. So both Lou and Neha, I know you both have seen this happen a bunch of times. This has still got to be the number one issue, right?
Yeah, this is one that we see a lot, and we also get a lot of affidavits sent to us, saying, look, they're swearing that they're not going to get this surgery, so we can go ahead and submit that along with the MSA, and then we can keep the lumbar fusion out of the MSA, right? And no, that's not the case, because CMS is always going to go back to what the treater is saying. So if the treater is recommending surgery, even if the claimant is adamant they will not get that surgery will be included in a CMS approved allocation. And the thought process behind that is, well, they're saying they're not going to get it now, but they could always change their mind. So Medicare is always going to want to be covered, right? If there's any sort of recommendation for anything, then the carrier is going to need to put that up front, whether or not the claimant's saying, well, I'm not going to get it. I promise I won't get it. I pinky promise, and I'll write this affidavit and all the things. It really needs to come from a treater to say it's no longer a recommended service, not just, the claimant's refusing to pursue it at this time.
Yeah, we're unfortunately, we live in a litigious society, and doctors are not going to say and change their minds on what they recommend for treatment just because someone doesn't want something, because they need to CYA to make sure that, when that litigation does come back to them, that they say, listen, I recommended the surgery. That person chose not to have it. It's on them, not me as the prescriber, as the treater, as the provider. So I think that it's a fine line to walk. It's a good place to utilize some type of evidence-based product if protocols will allow that. But really, it comes down to treaters are going to say what someone needs, not what necessarily someone wants to protect themselves. Yeah, let's move on to the next one, Marty.
Yeah, next one, dangling recommendation sort of related to that, which is that the doctor hasn't cleared up something, right? That whole, they might be a candidate for, and then you don't know that the person's going to pursue the treatment or not, but it's like 18 months out in the past and it just hasn't gone away, right? So this is a big issue for us. One thing that I'll say is how far out in the past it goes may kind of militate or dictate what you want to do strategically, because remember, it's the last 2 years of medical treatment records that you see, right? So if it's been 23 months of treatment records where the person was recommended for surgery and they're no longer really a candidate, but the doctor hasn't, as Lou said, closed the loop on that because they don't want to be sued, right? But you can still kind of wait those things out sometimes, but that's definitely number two, because especially if it's like, well, a year ago or so that they had this issue pop up. So with that being said, certainly we do have some ways to get doctors to kind of go more on the record as to, is the person still a candidate? I mean, it is a little bit of a gamble, right? If you're going to put that in the hands of a treater. But Neha and Lou both, we've created a letter that we can send out to beneficiaries, the treating physicians, to have them go on the record here. So I don't know if you want to kind of just real quick cover that, and or if there's any additional issues that you sort of uncover with these, what I'll call dangling recommendations.
We see this a lot. I mean, obviously we see it with surgical recommendations in implantations, but we see this a lot with prescription medications, where someone will be prescribed a particular drug on a one-time basis. We know that Medicare will look at that as ongoing if it's not specifically clarified. So that kind of prescription dangling recommendation could add hundreds of thousands of dollars to an MSA. So really getting clarification, and I think the doctors would be more likely to clarify the prescription issue rather than no longer recommend a treatment or surgery, and just saying, listen, that was a one-time use drug, that was a short-term use drug. The guidelines say that drug should not be more than 3 months. Those sorts of things. Getting clarifications with that can really reduce a Medicare set aside.
Yep. And that next one. Oh, go ahead, Neha.
Sorry. Yeah, we actually got a question that was sort of linked to that, as far as, what happens when you have an AME or a PQME that, does not recommend surgery, but the primary treater does. Will CMS add that surgery? And that's an absolute yes. So, this is the sort of caveat there, is if you're going to submit your MSA to CMS, they will put weight on the treater and not on an evaluator, right? They feel as though a treater is someone that sees the claimant on a consistent basis and has more of an understanding on what their current treatment should be. And so they sort of take these independent medical evaluations as, not as holding as much weight. So this is an instance where second opinions or evaluations can be good, and they can, give, I guess, that sort of evidence-based perspective on whether or not there are less invasive alternatives, or whether or not, surgery is actually appropriate. But if you're going to do that and then you're going to submit the allocation, that's where you kind of roll the dice. And so there's nothing inherently wrong with following the advice of an AME or a PQME. But if you're going to then submit that MSA to CMS, you really need to kind of play by their rules, and they have very black and white rules.
So next one, priced out of proportion to reality. So this happens, really kind of all the time. I'll give an example. In New Jersey, it's sort of widely known that in New Jersey, work comp MSAs that are submitted to CMS, the total, the per visit PT is going to be close to $500, right? That's just the way that Medicare prices it based upon the rules that they have in their evaluation process. That's out of proportion to reality. If that's the case, I'd be very happy to open a PT office in Union City, New Jersey. But of course, that's not, what we would normally see that anybody would pay. So there are a lot of little examples like that can lead to higher than anticipated, higher than wanted allocation amounts, and that's connected to number 5, right? Number 4 rather, which is all that darn PT, right? So for every single orthopedic injury that a person may have, if they get a shoulder and a knee, you're going to have at least 48 physical therapy visits for those 2 injuries. For 1 injury, it's 24, right? So if you get 3, you're looking at 72. So it can get really, really expensive just for PT alone. That has led to, I will just call it what it is, padding of an allocation, right? So certainly a person who has a lot of orthopedic injuries, they're going to probably go to the physical therapist over their life expectancy. Are they going to go 24 visits? Are they going to go 72 visits over their life expectancy? Not quite sure about that. So I don't know, Neha, if there are other examples if you see where, for lack of a better word, we'll call it padding the allocation, or Lou, if you have other examples, but PT is certainly one.
Yeah, so I mean, that sort of ties back to dangling recommendations as well, because when you have let's say a surgical recommendation, there's going to be added physical therapy that they're going to apply onto that. So even if you have, maybe a vague recommendation, something like, if symptoms worsen then X, and it's a surgery, you're not only getting PT for the body part, but then you're getting added PT for that surgery, plus the surgery will be added. So there's different ways in which all of that can sort of really inflate an MSA.
And then just the sheer volume of diagnostics that Medicare wants to see in an MSA, I mean, that much radiation isn't good for anyone. So I think that, but I'll take that up with the ODG. Good. Sorry.
You're on mute there, Marty.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that, guys. So absolutely, we go to the doctor for annual x-rays. I mean, I'm not sure that that's the wisest move, but certainly that's sometimes the way that CMS wants it done. The last one on their top 5 allocation issues is definitely having a handle on RX. And this is, more of a practice point than anything else for everybody, which is, when we think about RX, we really, CMS is going to look very closely at the last 90 days filled or last 180 days filled and amortize that out over the person's life expectancy, really than the last 2 years of medical records, right? There's not going to be, if you moved off of a drug, they're going to see that you moved off of that drug. So I don't know, Lou and Neha, if you have any pointers for folks who may be approaching settlement and the idea that, they're going to want to prepare their file to make sure that they're not paying for drugs that they may not otherwise want to pay for life.
Yeah, if we could go back to kind of where we began with this conversation, the overall MSA number and the percentage of the MSA that prescription drugs have decreased over the last few years. So I think as a whole, the industry has really done a nice job of getting a handle on prescription medication. They've gone to the doctor, they've gotten clarification on what's needed. They've moved to generic when possible. I think that needs to continue as we go on. And having that handle on drugs will really continue to drive down the cost of MSAs.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. I think. Go ahead, Neha. Sorry.
No, just going to echo that same thing. I think we've seen a lot of pharmacy programs with a lot of carriers that have, contributed to the decrease in prescriptions that we've seen. But, like you said, Marty, I think, takeaway from that or best practice is to make sure that, the prescription drug history is accurate and it's updated, and that, everything is being prescribed in a clinically appropriate manner, because there's so many different things you can do to mitigate costs there, whether it's, brand versus generic or whether it's weaning medications. So just sort of, like you said, having a handle on that can make a big difference.
Yeah, perfect. And Adriana, I think we can go on to Q&A. I don't know if you have any questions that have popped into the chat box or the Q&A box for us.
Yeah, we sure do. So I will start with, what about the VA? Some of my cases, the employee is a vet and they get whatever they need. I was told that, but the employee doesn't want to deal with workers' comp anymore.
Yeah, it's a good question. Certainly, when the person's going down a different path than workers' comp, it can be really challenging to gather the information that you need in order to submit the case to CMS for review and approval. So from a Medicare perspective, and this is the thing, we're going to always answer a question like that from a Medicare perspective. That is to say, if you're going to want to get Medicare to approve your Medicare set aside, your work comp Medicare set aside, they're not going to really care where the person is treating. They're going to care what the person is treating for, right? So if the person is treating for something that is industrial at the VA, they're going to want to see the medical records that could then be corresponding to that particular treatment. They're going to want that allocated within the MSA, even if it's the case that the VA is the one who is providing treatment to that individual for that particular injury. CMS is looking at it as, hey, if we're going to sign our name in the dotted line, we're going to want to make sure that we are covered for whatever reason. The VA, we don't expect the VA to go away. This is not an issue with that. But from Medicare's perspective, they're going to be bright line, and they're going to say, if it was work-related, we want to see medical records associated with that work-related injury, regardless of who's paying for it or regardless of who's treating for it. We want to have that information incorporated into our Medicare set. I said, if we're submitting it. Now, this brings back the whole other question that Lou had and Neha had earlier on, is like, well, maybe we might not submit. So those are all considerations outside of the submission process, but in that submission process itself, CMS wants to see it.
Thanks, Marty. And the next question we have is, what happens when, oh, I'm sorry. I think we already answered that one. So the next one is, what if a prior provider recommended a surgical procedure, but the current provider of same discipline does not recommend that surgery and clearly states that surgery is no longer necessary? Will CMS honor the current provider's recommendations versus the prior provider? Lou, did you want to take that one?
Yes. So it really comes down to who is controlling in Medicare's eyes. So if that new provider is the new treating doctor, then Medicare should abide by what that doctor says. If it's a situation where that new doctor is not a treater, but an independent medical exam, something along those lines, Medicare is going to go back to that original doctor. So a few things that you could do here is you could wait if you have the time, if the case is still ongoing, you can wait until that prior recommendation is out of the 2-year window. But what you should do is when you do submit that, if you are going to submit that for review and approval, highlight that the new treater is so-and-so and that they are no longer recommending a surgery.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the ECS on MSP podcast. We look forward to joining you next month for our next episode. For the latest updates and educational content from ECS, please visit our website at examworkscompliance.com. See you next time.